And it wasn't until I allowed myself to recognize the fact that like this is a narrative I am continually feeding and choosing and writing, and I have the power to change this narrative, that I was met with like my own blank slate. And I was kind of met with the reality of like, yeah, no, you've been choosing to live behind this feigned and forced hatred and like to put all the blame on like this thing happened to me and now this, like, if you make the brave decision to change that narrative, are you willing to actually face what now being vulnerable looks like, and what now allowing love in looks like, and what now standing in the empowerment of being your own, of living life for yourself and living life according to your true desires? Are you ready for the bravery of that now that you no longer have the excuse of, you know, I suffered abuse from my dad? Like, are you ready for that? Okay. Woo! Here we go. I've never really been nervous to make a video, but here I am being nervous to make a video. Hi everyone, what is up? That is where you reply. My name is Jasmine Kylene. I am a spiritual counselor, I'm a journalist, and I am a girl who's doing her just fucking absolute best, which you will see in today's video. So for context, tomorrow, February 5th, 2022, I turn 26 years old, and I have just arrived back from Arizona, which is where I was born, which also, side note, that is why, you know, I took a red eye. I'm not feeling my most rested and optimal, and I think that how we look externally is directly reflective of like where we're feeling internally, energetically. So I'm just, if you are like, Jazz, get some rest, same. But while I was in Arizona, my hometown of Tucson, ooh girl, oh God, I'm nervous. Basically, I saw my dad for the first time in basically 6 years. As an Aquarius, I'm one of those people who went from like not sharing anything to being like overwhelmingly vulnerable about so many parts of my life. And so I'm trying to maintain balance between how much of me is accessible, but like my dad stuff is something that I'm not as open about. More so in protection of like the people involved than myself, but I will talk about this experience because I think there's so much nectar to be taken from my individual experience in relation to forgiving your parents, which you could see from the title of this video. And I want to share it in hopes of either giving someone the comfort of knowing that they're not on that journey alone, or maybe inspiring someone to embark on the journey themselves. I want to first and foremost say that I'm in no way, shape, or form an expert when it comes to familial dynamics, and I don't want to make it seem as if I am bypassing abuse, particularly if you are still experiencing the abuse, emotional, physical, in any kind of way, shape, or form from your parent. And something that I really want to make clear is that forgiveness is not bypassing. I am well aware of how irresponsible the decisions that my dad and my mom honestly made in their adulthood in relation to me, and I've held them accountable. I continue to hold them accountable, but forgiveness to me and what I've experienced and what I'll talk about is sort of like watching that accountability, understanding that accountability, but ultimately setting yourself free from how heavy and how stagnant the energy of being angry at a parent can be. And forgiveness can mean maintaining healthy boundaries and shifting expectations of them. You know, I'm not saying that, you know, now that I've forgiven my father, I expect him to be this like present figure in my life, or that I'm, you know, like requesting for him to be someone who has some sort of like continual role in my life. But it's more so of like, I'm releasing the weight of hating him, and it's for me. So I'll talk about why this is important. So I'm not gonna get into like the entire context of like what happened, but like the struggle and the strain between my father and I's relationship was rooted in addiction and mental illness. And when I saw him this past weekend for the first time in 6 years, it was the first time in his life that he had ever been sober. And so I felt like I kind of met him for the first time. And so I bring that up to say that I was able for the first time to see the human in him, to understand that so many of his decisions were not derivative of a lack of soul or a lack of humanity, but rather it was derivative of the suffering of his own upbringing, his addictions. And it's difficult because I think societally we treat addiction as something that is, sort of like self-inflicted, and at times it can be, but we don't recognize the disease in it, and we don't recognize how it disconnects that person from their own ability to be cognizant and human. And it's not something to punish people over, but rather something to kind of hold their hand through. And so I bring that up to say that in whatever situation and whatever thing you are dissecting when it comes to your experience with your parent, individual or both, if you can find a way to find the humanity behind the decisions that they've made and the experiences that they've had, and how those experiences have filtered how they've shown up as parents for you, whether they were incredibly hard on you, whether they were incredibly cold or distant, find a way to dissect where they experienced that. I think everything in our human experience can be boiled down to some form of love, whether they think that the way that they raised you was how love was supposed to look like, or the way that they raised you was derivative of a lack of love that they experienced. If you can really just boil down and see the human in the way that they showed up for you, the way that how they thought they were loving you, of course, was painful or, destructive, but ultimately it was their form of affection or love, or whatever the case may be. Of course, I don't know everyone's individual experience, but I can say that boiling things down to the human and the love, and ultimately just looking at your parent and seeing the inner child in them and understanding that their inner child is like navigating this world as best as they can, and understanding that we are just all products of our parents, and they may have continued a cycle, but you have the ability to stand in the here and the now and break that generational curse, break that cycle. And the first step into breaking that cycle is to forgive. And the reason why this is so important is because forgiveness is for you. It is not for them, especially if you're in a place where you are still angry. Understand that the act of forgiveness has nothing to do with what it'll do for them. It's not giving them the check mark like, oh, okay, it's cool that I, harmed my kid in any kind of way, I can get away with it. It's more so of understanding that the experience that we have with our parents is going to bleed into all of our relational dynamics. And I recognize that I sort of built an identity in a world behind having daddy issues, right? The way that I show up in my romantic dynamics, I'm someone who kind of keeps most people at an arm's length. I'm kind of emotionally disconnected. I tend to self-sabotage when things get too vulnerable or too real, or commitment is rather scary for me. And it's a dynamic that I've talked about, especially with the Saturn Mastery video, of I really am so adamant about breaking this cycle for myself. And I had to first and foremost recognize where did that come from? And of course it came from my experience with my dad, but it's just, you have the power to change the narrative. And I built such a comfort in this narrative of I have abandonment issues from my dad, and so therefore I'm going to continue to play out the fear of abandonment, and therefore rejecting others before they can reject me in my romantic dynamics. I can change that. I can change that in the language of it, first and foremost. When people would ask about my dad or bring him up, I would immediately be like, oh yeah, no, my dad's trash, I have this broken relationship. And now I can say, oh, I love my dad, he has his things, but we're mending our relationship. And just that simple change in language communicates something so loudly to your journey. And I was someone who made such light of how I showed up relationally, and I was like, yeah, no, I have daddy issues, so I'm basically always self-sabotaging, and I never really let someone in. And I think it was funny. It was funny to be that archetype. It was funny to be the girl that, like, you know, is always perpetually single. But but now, you know, I changed the verbiage. You know, intimacy and vulnerability is something that I've struggled with in the past because of, you know, past experiences, but I'm working through it because ultimately I do want a healthy and present and consistent and committed partnership. And it's just those small verbiage changes that, if anything, will kind of train your mind to really feel that way, especially if you're so disconnected from the feeling of forgiveness. Understand that, like, changing the way that you speak about your experience and the way that you identify yourself is a beautiful first step, because I think, and what I've learned in my personal experience, is that the scariest part of this whole thing has been no longer having my daddy issues to hide behind. I use my daddy issues as an excuse to be self-sabotaging my relationships and to attract the same kind of, like, emotionally unavailable partners. And it wasn't until I allowed myself to recognize the fact that, like, this is a narrative I am continually feeding and choosing and writing, and I have the power to change this narrative, that I was met with, like, my own blank slate. And I was kind of met with the reality of, like, yeah, no, you've been choosing to live behind this feigned and forced hatred and, like, to put all the blame on, like, this thing happened to me and now this, like, if you make the brave decision to change that narrative, are you willing to actually face what now being vulnerable looks like, and what now allowing love in looks like, and what now standing in the empowerment of being your own, of living life for yourself and living life according to your true desires? Are you ready for the bravery of that now that you no longer have the excuse of, you know, I suffered abuse from my dad? Like, are you ready for that? I hope that I'm making sense. This is like just a stream of consciousness, and there are some times when it flows a bit easier than others on this one. I think it's because I'm kind of nervous talking about this, but I think I don't know. Whatever is standing in the middle of you and who you want to arrive at tends to be a form of fear. And so I think there's a fear that I'm kind of working through to stand in who I am on the other side of this, which is ultimately someone who recognizes that we are all mirrors. And I think that my soul chose my parents. I believe that fully. I think I had the most incredible mom, and I think that I have the most incredible dad. They were the perfect parents for me. And the experiences that I had relative to the life that they gifted me and the dynamics that I experienced, they deepened me. And ultimately, I think the pain and the beauty of all of it has gifted me with the tools and the words and the experiences necessary for me to stand in my power, and for me to connect deeper with those that are also experiencing them, and ultimately to stand in some sort of like leadership role in terms of, like, how we can self-liberate and how we can change the narrative. And once again, I want to explicitly emphasize the fact that forgiveness is not bypassing. And I have a gorgeous, amazing, beautiful friend, Hannah Weiser. We were talking about something, you know, I mean, this topic, and she said to me, if a toddler is driving a car, you don't get mad at the toddler for driving, you just get out of the way. And that has been, like, the theme of how I have navigated understanding my parents, building healthy boundaries with my parents, and ultimately forgiving them. That toddler got behind the wheel. That toddler probably shouldn't have been driving, but ultimately, are you gonna scorn the toddler for driving and, you know, build all of your life experiences and relational dynamics under the guise of, you know, oh, my toddler-ass mom drove the car and I got all these bumps and bruises? Or can you just get out of the way? And if there's destruction that toddler is going to continue to get themselves in, can you release responsibility for it and say, I'm gonna build a healthy dynamic, healthy boundaries. I'm going to meet you where you are at and no longer expect certain things, give myself the things that I may have wanted to experience from you, but ultimately forgive you because you don't know better, you know. And it's a difficult thing to understand, because especially as adults, you should know better, right? I think for me, I would look at my parent, I would look at my dad and say, you know, you're at the age where you should know better. You know, this isn't, you know, you're not fucking 16. You should know by now that this isn't how you dad. But like going back to the toddler metaphor, I think we stand in our unhealed inner child when we don't receive certain closures. And I think that he will forever, I mean, he's getting better and I want to give him, you know, I want to give him his flowers, babe, he's sober, but like until we have a fully formed sense of self-awareness and until we experience certain closures and facilitate that closure for ourselves, we are going to stand in our unhealed inner child. And I think because he is standing in a lot of his unhealed inner child and making a lot of decisions through that unhealed inner child, he's going to kind of in a lot of cognitive ways be a toddler. And I just have to recognize that so much of the decisions that he's made and the way that I've been affected from them has been done through the lens of what he has experienced, what he hasn't experienced. And forgiveness is just so freeing. It's so forgiving to understand that everything that has happened to you, you're not deserving of. You're not deserving of abuse or abandonment or whatever, but you can change the narrative by understanding that like in some way, shape, or form, I can make this something that happened for me. I can take a lesson and I can weld it into how I show up for community. I can weld it into how I show up for my partners and my friends. And I can understand that it deepened my strength. It deepened who I am now as a mother or a sister or, you know, a leader and a partner especially. And you can take accountability. This has been large for me, but I can take accountability for the comfort that I have built in having that narrative. I built such a comfort in having daddy issues because it was this kind of like this excuse. Like it's the same thing as like, oh, you know, I'm a Scorpio, so of course I'm gonna, you know, be manipulative. And it's like people can kind of like use the titles that they've given themselves to be excuses for why they aren't, you know, why they don't exercise healthier ways of being. And so for me, I was like, oh yeah, you know, I'm one of those like girls who has daddy issues. And so like, that's why I keep having this relational dynamic. Like, okay, we get it. We got it 17 times ago. Do you want to stay there? Or do you want to, you know, face the fact that you are afraid of what no longer having that as an excuse looks like and how you're going to ultimately have to take back responsibility for your life and for your experiences and your relationships. And so, yeah. So understand that it's scary to no longer hide behind the comfort of hating them, especially if you've kind of found a comfort in that chaos. But forgiving them is not bypassing, surrendering to understanding that they are human, having a human experience, and that you can adjust how you stand in front of that car. You can send them love. You can see the human and the lack of love, or how they define love, you know, through how they, you know, experienced you and how you experienced them. But I don't know, it's less of forgiving your parents and more so of taking back your power in terms of how your story is written. And as I step into 26, oh, sorry, oh my God, I scared my dog. See? That's probably trauma that she's gonna have to like deconstruct in therapy for 4 years, me being a parent figure for her. And it was just me being human and making an honest mistake. I'm sorry, baby. Also, yes, I have 2 earrings on. I should have said that earlier. This whole time you're probably like, does she know? She knows. Anyway though, yes, as I step into 26 tomorrow, I am so committed to standing in my fullest fucking potential professionally, romantically, socially, inwardly, outwardly. Like I'm just so committed to living as fully as I possibly can and to coming back to the narrative that like my life is mine and my choices are mine and my energy is mine and how I show up in this world is mine. It's my decision. And I am no longer allowing societal conditioning or, you know, I'm no longer letting anything else drive the car. And so I really had to take the time to recognize, you know, what habits, what dynamics, what cycles do I no longer want to feed? Where do they come from? And where can I take my power back in changing that narrative? And I just didn't want to give, you know, this experience with my dad any more power to keep me stagnant and keep me in an old identity. I built such an identity in having this like strained relationship. I think it's kind of cool to have suffering these days. You know, it's kind of cool to trauma bond with everyone. And so, you know, there's a lot of time for everything. I've been deconstructing my story with my dad for years through therapy. So like, don't skip that part. Don't, you know, like deconstruct it, mourn it, sit with the pain of it. But when you are ready, you'll know when you're ready, let it go. Just let it go and understand that, you know, when we stand in a form of wholeness, there's pain and there's wounds within that. It's not like we're like all of these million fragmented pieces and we're trying to figure out how to tape them together. Like, you're whole in this given moment, and within your wholeness, you can have the pain of abandonment. You know, it's not to say that forgiving them means how they hurt you is going to go away, how they affected you is no longer going to show up. Like, that's all still going to be there. It's rather making the conscious and active choice to no longer steep yourself in victimhood that is going to bleed into the rest of the cycles of your life. And understand that like there's such a magnetism that comes with filtering all of your experiences and all of the people that show up in your life as lessons and as mirrors. And when you deconstruct everything down to the humanness and the love or the lack of love, I keep repeating the same thing, but it's really what's helped me. When you deconstruct all of that down to like, they were doing what they thought was their best, and I'm doing what I think is the best every single day. You begin to see yourself a bit in your parents. You begin to see how fragile and fallible we all are. And I don't know, it's freeing. So it's not something that happens overnight, nor is it something that I'm mastering. I'm working towards it. I'm sitting in it. I'm basking in the exhale of it, of like knowing like, oh, I can let this go. I can stop suffering from this. I can get out of the way of their car. It's a journey, but I'm really grateful to be walking into 26 here. And yeah. So I hope that this served you in some kind of way. I hope that either I affirmed something for you or invited you to look at something, journal on it, sit with it, have conversations. You know, over the weekend when I saw my dad, I asked questions, and I heard him and watched him take accountability, and that helped me a lot. And so if you can get your parent to a place with some level of self-awareness, that obviously helps. But this is a journey. It isn't perfect. It's messy, and it's much easier to stand in a place where you are striving for wholeness rather than perfection. So understand that wholeness means no longer building an identity under your fragmented pieces or your wounds and your shit, but rather understanding that all that exists within the pristine condition of you. So yeah, now I'm just saying too many words. I love you guys so much. Of course, me doing random promo after talking about like the depths of my fucking like, oh God. Do you know, this is probably a more, should I say this? Okay, I'll say a surface level. I have a half sister who I adore with every fiber of my being, and we both had very distinct experiences of our father. My suffering was more so the void of him, and her suffering was the experience of him. And I think every pain is valid. I think every wound is valid, and so I'm not invalidating my pain, but I will say that when you break down both stories, hers seems to be a little worse, to be honest. I think she dealt with God. She dealt with the worser narrative, and she forgave him a long time ago. And I remember watching her forgive him, her having, I think, a worse experience of him, and me being like, what the fuck? Like, you can do it, and like, what are you doing? Why are you forgiving him? And meanwhile, I had a valid but smaller form of suffering from him, and that's when I kind of realized this is a choice. Like, I'm actively choosing to have pain here. And like I said, the pain isn't gonna go away, but how you respond to it, how you feed it, how you build a home within it, that can change. So yeah, so I hope that you feel empowered enough to embrace setting yourself free. And yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to go dance to some groovy music with some friends for my birthday, and I'm sending you all my love. Of course, subscribe if you feel called to. If you want to do a one-on-one with me, I do chart readings and spiritual counseling sessions. Feel free to reach out. I also do a lot of writing and other stuff, so just follow me on Instagram or visit my website at Jasmine Kylene if you want to experience any of those things. And yeah, I'm sending you all my love. Bye!